I'd like to talk about today is an opening that is very famous, I'd say, for its safetyness and, most importantly, the solid positions that it actually provides to black. What we're talking about right now is the 𝐶𝐴 defense. The 𝐶𝐴 defense arises after the first moves of e4, c6, d4, d5, and now we have the typical 𝐶𝐴 opening. The main idea of the 𝐶𝐴 for black is to counter white's center, and essentially, instead of hoping, as in a Sicilian and some other opening lines, to maybe we can say leave the center, develop, and then counter it, black is trying to put up some pressure and eventually counter as fast as he could the center in white's territory. Like the e4 pawn now gets actually a little attacked, and this makes white to think carefully, as it's not quite clear how he can stabilize on that area. What should white do at that point? Should he develop with knight c3 to support the pawn, or he should play e5 or exchange? Well, actually, all these moves happen possible, and even there is another crazy move, which is f3. I think it was called the fantasy variation, which happens sometimes as a surprise. I'm going to show you right now both how to play against and with the 𝐶𝐴, and some very good ideas which you can use right into your next games if you want to give a try with or against this opening. First of all, let's see what happens in case white decides to exchange and say on the d5 and eventually considers the possibility to play the exchange variation. The exchange variation with e takes to the d and c takes to the d happens in quite so many games, especially by players who don't know this opening so well. And yet if they know it, the exchange could be pretty interesting. Now, there are two ways how the exchange could be played. The first way is with the so-called pan-off attack with knight f3 and c4 that will help white to open up his spaces at the cost of creating an isolated pawn, which is certainly one kind of a pawn weakness that he may have problems with. He's going to get more space, development, and even better center at the cost of this. On the other hand, the other possibility could be a little safer, and it may actually go with the move of bishop d3, which may guarantee white a little bit faster development, like bishop d3 and bishop f4, which is the original exchange variation and is also considered very interesting. Let's begin with these, and then we're going to continue with the other lines, like the advanced variation of e5 or the standard 𝐶𝐴 with knight c3. After e takes to the d, c takes to the d, and now the move of knight f3. After black plays knight f6 and then white does c4, the most favorable variation for white is when black takes with d takes to c, so that white can recapture with his bishop, and then he gets a very spacey and straightforward development. Casting on the short side, developing his bishop on e3, and getting forward with the queen and the two rooks is obviously going to give white a lot of space and more attacking possibilities, not only towards the center but also on the king side as well. Setting up the knight on e5 and just going for the f4, rook f3 is going to give him a huge amount of control and a lot of opportunities right on that king side area. This is something very beautiful. What else can black do then if he doesn't want to do this? Well, after pawn to c4, one of the best ways how black can go is with knight to c6. Going up with knight to c6 can also connect a move like e6 to be played, which will help black's bishop to develop and even consider castling on the short side. The plan of that is to wait until white's light square bishop gets out, because sooner or later, if white doesn't want to exchange, which will completely equalize and pose black no problems, white will have to develop his bishop, which will give black a chance to exchange and force white's bishop to take back in two moves. This extra tempo that black will win is certainly a very good idea. So, after the move of e6, what should white do if he doesn't want to lose a tempo? Well, the possibility of white is c5, and now that's a bit problematic for black. The reason is because if he plays b6 to drive that pawn away, what we find is that white can do bishop b5 to attack this knight, and ultimately there could be knight e5 and queen e4 to attack straight ahead against c6. So, this is a very nice and very natural way to go. Now, what should black do about that? I mean, because c5 obviously doesn't sound good. Well, if he wants to get a good position, there is bishop e7 and he may delay the move knight e6 a little bit. If knight e6 is played, then c5, bishop b5 is possible. Nevertheless, if c5 is played now without knight e6, there could be b6, and after b4, a5, challenging both c5 and b4 with the two pawns on b6 and a5, and making it more difficult for white to arrange his possibilities. So this just doesn't look like one of the best opportunities for white. So what else can white play? Well, now I guess after a little while he has to admit that maybe c5 is not good, exchange is not good, so he'll lose the tempo and yet get this position. Having a tempo up, black may have a good idea to play against the isolated pawn. And usually the typical idea when we have such positions with an isolated pawn is generally to like blockade the pawn. This is what we call a mechanical blockade, to fix it. Consider some exchanges, maybe after b6, bishop to b7 and rook c8, and as more exchanges happen, or as more possibilities are the game goes further, the position can get simplified, and black can get his own play in a good manner. I think that if we have to talk or we have to speak about this whole opening from both white's and black's actual perspective, what we understand is that it's his complex position. I mean, no, I don't think that white is bad here. The isolated pawn can be very easily protected, but I think black can also consider simplifying the position and then putting pressure, adding some attack against d4 at a later stage. So pretty much after knight e6 everything is sort of good, and I think decent for white. But if white doesn't play knight e6, it's he has a slightly more important development. So what happens if white does the bishop d3, which after knight e6 can lead him to c3? Well, in this case, on many occasions, black turns out to play queen c7, which can cut off f4 for the bishop. It's known as the most wide responses by black, because that's how white's bishop cannot get in there, and he can't have that formation. So result, however, which I like very much as white, is h3, and after knight f6, knight f3. That development helps white to actually get the development completed, and it blockades black's opportunity to bring his bishop out there. The position remains quite complex, and although white has a good development, black is also quite capable to prepare an attack on the queen side. And this fianchetto and the possibilities of these pawns that actually lock up and don't let the light square bishop to penetrate the position or create some threats. So black's opposite possibilities on the queen side can guarantee him the advance, the ability to exchange some pawns, like open some new files and directions, and get his attack going. The position is certainly interesting, but going backwards a little bit to the essential game, many chess players forget about queen c7, which should give him a decent play and a good combination of development and straightforward moves. And so instead of this, one of the major moves that may happen actually is the continuation, what we call it, with the move of knight f6. Now after knight f6, white can immediately use the opportunity to develop his bishop on that diagonal, and therefore prevent queen c7. Once that move is made, after bishop g4, usually the plan is to get queen b3, and the development later happens in a very straightforward manner, where white will bring his own knight on f3, castle, and quickly decide to set up more pieces so that at one point he can bring his knight onto e5 and get ready to attack on the king's side. Black's queen on c8 as well as the bishop on e7 just don't look that active, while in the meantime what we also find is that the rook on from g3 and the rest of the attacking possibilities against black's king will fall. We also understand that the queen's activity, which was very good when the bishop was on the g7, is going to have a little bit of a hard time, as the attack may be much more straight and go forward. So it is quite complex, and I would say interesting for both sides. If we go backward to the actual position from d4, d5, e takes d, c takes d, I have to say that many chess players, in order to avoid the complications that may happen with the variation of e6, they play the fianchetto immediately. That to a certain extent may help, although I have to admit, after h3, it leads to a sort of double-edged position. White's attack on the king side will sooner or later follow. Maybe a little bit of a delay, but it will happen. Wow, actually black cannot bring his bishop on f5. That is considered by some people good, simply because of the g4 and the great opportunity that if exchange takes place, black can rather castle on queen side and attack towards that king side area. It's a complex opening, but certainly interesting, and I like the exchange variation of Caro-Kann more than any other opening system, especially when I play it as white. Then now we have to take a look at the most common. I mean, the most popular opening is obviously the advanced variation. Now, the advanced variation is common because many chess players consider it well to push the pawn onto e5 and stop the f6 square. Hold that spot so that black's knight cannot come out there. The move of e5 also sets the idea that when there is there are 4 to 4 pawns on the king side, it may really help white to develop quick enough. And with that fast development, this e5 is going to limit the black pieces which are going to stay around the queen side and concentrate all his actions and sort of strong activity to go right onto the king side area. That in the beginning sounds like a really good idea. So this is ultimately what goes. After third e5, black has 2 ways to go. The first and more popular amongst the Grandmaster games is the move of bishop f5. Setting the bishop on f5 is good because if white plays bishop d3, in this case his most valuable piece, the light square bishop, will easily get exchanged, and that will guarantee, in my opinion, quite a quick and nice, solid to follow development from black side. After bishop f5, the key plan coming by white side has to be to play g4. Eventually, trying to take that bishop away or take it off is one of the best plans to go for. So after bishop to g6, then there is h4, and yeah, going a little bit more straightforward like that is certainly helpful. Planning for a move like h4, we get the 2 pawns, we get an opportunity to play for f3, not e2, not f4, which is, I think it's a quite a decent way to go. Well, truly, it seems good. The h6, then eventually white could play for f3, knight e2, knight f4, and most people even do play after the move of bishop to g6, the move of knight e2, so that they can get ready for knight f4. I like this move, and this is why, because of the lines of h4, sometimes there could be even knight h3. Actually, knight e2 is not that great because the bishop can come at e4, and then f3 is no longer possible. Now, the important is that when the bishop comes there, we would like to attack it and drive it away. So the move of knight h3 makes quite some sense. Then there could be e6, and there is knight f4, bishop h7. I don't have really that great experience with that variation, but one thing that I know is that it's very uncomfortable, and the majority of chess players find it inconvenient or extremely inconvenient for black. This is why what I like to play as from black side is to go with the instant variation of c5. c5 is the better recommendation that leads to sort of French defense type of position, in which, however, there isn't the main drawback of black, which in French defense, when black has his own pawn on e6, the light square bishop cannot come out. Now, the diagonal, of this bishop is actually more open. So at any point later, he may consider bringing it out to the f5 and then probably playing with e6 to get the dark squared bishops out. After c5, obviously if white plays c3 and then black plays knight c6, knight f3 and then bishop to g4, white has an awkward French. He can't fight for a major advantage out there, and when the knight is pinned, there is the d4 pawn that will get attacked and probably even taken. This is why, after the move of c5, the only way a white can try to fight for advantage is via d takes to c. Winning that pawn with his own is going to help him to quickly develop and consider playing bishop to b5 at a later stage. Yet, this variation, even nowadays, is considered not really that dangerous for black, and the game could continue like this. So play e6. So we have e6, white obviously protects the pawn, and now black gets to develop his own knight to e7. By supporting the knight on c7, so that after c3, and bishop to d7, black has this very smart combination that can go with knight takes c5. Even if white protects the pawn, there's knight takes e5 that can really equalize the material, if not else. So we find out that there is bishop takes d7 and there is knight takes d7. So there is like the possibility of black to continue the development, and it's really going sort of straightforward. I don't want to say that this is a really great and fantastic position for black, but I think that he's keeping at least equality in his available at his disposal. So for instance, we find out that there is bishop takes the c, knight takes to the c. Attacking the pawn can be stopped by f4. But you see now white spent so many moves to really support the center or the pawns or anything that now after f4, essentially black can get ready to play for g5, that is putting an instant attack against f4 and potentially even against e5 later on. And it makes it even more difficult for white to arrange the proper pawn's formation. Let's say after g5, then often white plays f takes g5, and then black can do knight takes c5. It's a very double-edged position, but I think that both white and black have their own chances and possibilities. And that's what happens against one of the most common for intermediate or beginner chess players, 𝐂 advanced variation. The summary which I can make about this opening is that usually it leads white to a position where there's a bigger chance for black to make a mistake. So, more problematic. It's like a more problematic position for black, which is good. However, if black finds the right way to play it, I think that he can get a very decent development and certainly some solid possibilities to equalize. Now, we turn our attention to the classical 𝐂𝐚 in the knight c3. After the exchange and recaptures, here the main plan of black could be either to fight for a quick development or counter against white's center. The most popular variation is obviously the classical system with bishop f5. There also exists the line of knight f6 and the variation with knight d7. We can have a short look at each of them right now. Knight f6 is a line that I particularly find interesting, as after knight takes f6, e takes f6 doesn't look good because the double pawns and white's major possibilities in the center may guarantee him some good and maybe we can say easier development. But g takes f6 is a different story. Black's plan in this way will be to use the g file, not in order to castle there, which will certainly be bad as the king will be quite exposed, but to rather consider moving up with rook to g8 and therefore setting up some pressure over g2. Playing it like that is going to guarantee black some very nice activities. And although he's not planning to go rook g8 immediately, I think that after bishop g4, knight d7, short castles, queen c7, pawn e6, and eventually the possibility of long castle, doesn't matter what white plays, is going to give black some actual extra space and some black extra space and activity. So later on he can go for rook g8, f5, and even the development of his bishop on d6. Of course, white's own activity will go on the queen side with something like b4, but black is having some decent resources, and that's why I think that this variation is a little more counterattacking and therefore quite interesting for black from the 𝐂𝐚's perspective. The line of knight d7 is more of a quiet variation. Usually it connects to the idea of playing knight to f6 quickly, and although it loses a couple of tempi until black does it, I think that he's still able to fight for equality. I most don't like this line because it's rather passive and it can give white the ability to fight for a stronger development and pressure. This is, however, one of the other systems that black has available. And now we go on with the so-called classical or a Capablanca variation of bishop f5. I find that one to be the most interesting, and yet the idea of black is to quickly develop the bishop and therefore put pressure against that knight, making it therefore to go away. Later, white tries to trap down this bishop, or at least make the bishop go away. And when the bishop goes back, because this bishop is pretty unpleasant on that diagonal, white will finally decide to exchange it in order to get his queen a little further and develop well. After queen a5 check, and queen c7 maybe we can say, queen a5 is not needed because of bishop d2. Bishop d2 now, long castles and long castles. I think that the structure that both players are going to get is quite decent. Black will prepare to get his king back to safety, and after a couple of developing moves, perhaps he can prepare to break in the center and get his own rook as well as some of the other pieces open. White will try to prove that his space is a little more consistent, and sometimes White even tries more active ways like knight e4 to exchange the knight, get a better control, and potentially utilize the e5 spot at some point. It's a rather equal position, but it was very much favored of Anatoly Karpov and others who used it successfully quite some years ago. And I think that the Caro-Kann is definitely a weapon to be used by any positional player who wants more of a quiet game without that many complications.